Welcome to another episode of Abstract Amoeba, our lovely chat show where we're going to be talking about a couple of social issues on this occasion. In particular, we are going to be talking about the relevancy of the Black Lives Matter movement in today's age. But before we get into that, maybe we need to open up this discussion about the importance of history and understanding it. Who's got the opening words?
No, before we started, for me personally, history is always something that's always interested me. And obviously, whenever you look back at old, stories or accounts, one thing that is always constant: humans are always the same. There's this weird thing where humans in the before times were more noble, or they're more just, or this and that. No. We're the same people. We have the same issues and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, and also another thing I was saying was obviously the vastness of it. Okay, where do I start with history? Such a big term. Do I start with European history? Do I start with African? Do I start with American? But one thing that's always interesting, they always kind of bleed into each other, whether it's because of trade routes or wars and stuff. There's always some kind of weird shared history, and I find really fascinating. But yeah, that's my initial thoughts on it. I'm sure we'll get into it.
History is shared history. History proper, or history with a capital H, uppercase H, is shared history. Now I know that some people may beg to differ, because obviously each culture, each group of people have a history of their own. A history that they can call their own. Whether you're talking about people within Polynesia, you're talking about people within Persia, you're talking about people within certain parts of Africa. Obviously, there's a different history there. But if we are truly saying that, we want to be essentially global citizens, a lot of people, and obviously we're going to look at BLM today, are talking about this idea of equity across the board. Okay, and if that's the case, if we're talking about equality across the board, then we should also be able to share history. If we can share the material gains of a capitalist society, we can also share the sort of knowledge of that society, the culture. Because when we talk about culture, we're also talking about that which the culture deems to be important in terms of works of literature, works of art, and so on. So I think when I think about history, I think it's a shared history. It's the story of human beings and the struggle, to become more self-reliant, to become, a sort of towering, I suppose you could say, block of strength or whatever, for a better term. So that's kind of that. History, I think it's something that's shared anyway.
Yeah, I completely agree. But then I think that highlights something, and what it highlights is the very siloed nature in which we learn history in school, which is obviously the main way the majority of us would learn about our history. Bizarrely, I do think actually, where do we start? I think there is an answer for that. I think we should start with the most recent history and work your way backwards. Kind of like it's almost like you're starting with the answer in that sense. Like, well, let's explain the world today by looking bit by bit further and further and further and further back in time, which I think is something that helped me because, as you were just saying before we started recording, I never really had much of an interest in history going through school. Course 1066, Oliver Cromwell, all those other types of things that we learn about, Henry VIII.
English Civil War.
English Civil War, exactly. We learn War of the Roses and all of that stuff. We learn the sound bites about the Crusades and World War II. But there's no consistent flow. It's almost like completely separate events, unique to the UK or unique to England and unique to that period of time. And we don't have any real fluency to really give us an actual understanding. And so the reason why actually my viewpoint on this changed, because for me, I was very much the type of person who was like, it's in the past, it's happened. What matters is we teach kids about what's important today. We need to teach kids about the sciences of today in order for them to progress. But what's increasingly apparent is that without context, it's very difficult to judge actions and to judge the potential impact and learn from errors of the past. And so typically, I mean, as we saw last year, and I know we'll go into BLM in a bit more detail, but the whole thing about pulling statues down, the fact that people were surprised when they learned the history of certain important public figures, doesn't really, in my opinion, is not a reflection of wokeism or social justice warriors or whatever people would call it. It's actually more a reflection of our collective ignorance of the interlinked nature of our well-being. Like Michael was just saying, I think we're all saying, like, everything is layered on top of each other. Everything is linked. That's, I think that's the way we need to see it. And without, for example, if we start in a modern context, if we don't truly understand the fundamental economics of Napoleon-era Europe, then we really don't understand the reasons for the First World War. And if we don't understand that, we don't understand the reasons for the Second World War. We then don't understand the reasons for the Cold War or for Israel and Palestine and for the falling of the Berlin Wall. And we don't really have the context for...
Even though you could argue the whole Israel and Palestine thing is something which stretches far back into, like, far beyond the first century, beyond that to the times of
Crusades.
Testament. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
that's a fair point. But a lot of what it is today is a fallout of the World War, if you know what I'm trying to say. So it, like I was saying before, it's all a knockoff. Same thing with Saddam and America kind of paving the way for him to sort out the Turks. We all know what happened to him at the end. You know what I mean? It's yeah, it's convenient.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, exactly. Or whether it's
wasn't he cryogenically frozen? Is
that
yes. Already with the jokes, yes. But,
right. So that's basically the real life demolition man, yeah? So in 100 years' time, Saddam's going to come out of the freezer.
With the orange laptop. Or what's it called? The Civil War in America, somehow being linked, obviously, to how they wanted the slave trade to continue. And so, I mean, going back to it's just all linked. It's just a domino effect.
And to be very contextual, in this current climate, we've got a situation in Afghanistan that's developed where
exactly
American and allied forces have removed their troops from the region entirely. And as such, the Taliban have moved back into the region and are taking control. And last week took over Kabul, and there's a lot of concern for the people there. And even something like that, in our lifetime, we've been in conflict in Afghanistan for 20 years, right? But that's not the first conflict in Afghanistan. There were previous conflicts in that area, previous struggles between Russia, proxy wars between Russia and the US, trying to determine the fate of the Cold War. And even some would argue Russia's defeat in Afghanistan is what led to the fall of the Soviet Union, because they lost the government lost a lot of popular support. And even prior to that, Britain were involved in Afghanistan trying to build trade routes and secure access to the opium poppies and all of these types of things, which play into the reason why the situation is what it is. People can also bring up the fact that, yes, it was the US that originally armed the Taliban to fight against the Soviet Union, who once cleared out the Soviet Union, then started harboring terrorists and everything else. Like, it's such a smorgasbord.
This is why anytime I hear, a current sitting president disparage a previous president, for me, it seems it's more like political gameplay.
It's a joke.
Because for me, ultimately, if we're talking about this idea of context and this idea of a domino effect, it's not solely the issue of the previous administration. It's bigger than that. But of course, for political clout, to vilify one side, to vilify the person that who's no longer in power so that you can somehow bolster your own political standing in the present, people are going to do that. Biden. But the thing is,
slopey shoulders. That's like slopey shoulders on a major international level. Like the other guy did it.
Yeah, big time.
It was like that when I go.
But without being, I don't want to sound like completely cynical about politics and stuff. But to me, sometimes it does seem like a bit of a joke. For example, full disclosure, this is something I actually learned quite recently. The Democrats in America, apparently when the party actually started, they were actually technically a more right-leaning.
They were pro-slavery.
Yeah, they were actually right-leaning.
And pro-slavery. Yeah.
So it's kind of like, what are the true tenets of these parties? Like, does it even matter? I mean, we've seen, like, for example, Bush and Obama a couple of years ago. Now they're chums. It's like, and then you hear like a lot of them are related. And is this really just a joke? Is this really just a game?
Well, I would say like it's not, because things should be allowed to change. Things should be allowed to recognize, okay, we're in the wrong and we need to adapt ourselves to be.
That's a fair point.
But we shouldn't hide our history. So when I believe Joe Biden previously has said, you're not black unless you vote Democrat, basically.
Yeah.
Statements along those lines, right?
It's terrible. That's a terrible thing to say.
Maybe some proponents of his would say it was a gaffe. He didn't mean to say it. But the point is, he said it. And what he said, what he articulated is maybe
down the histories, man.
That a lot of people either subconsciously feel people think, or maybe that's what he assumes. But the reality is, the history of the Democratic Party shouldn't be hidden, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
No one's history should be hidden. And I think there is a thing here about this sort of almost revisionist approach to history.
Which I find very upsetting, actually.
The narrative we tell about ourselves. Because if we allow that to happen too easily, without question or without challenge, then we can end up in a scenario where we completely ignore what positive things someone may have done for a country or group of people or whatever, in favor of essentially criticizing them for a particular moral value that doesn't reflect our current status.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think one of the things that I was thinking about as you were speaking, just from a sort of education perspective, because you were talking about, okay, where do you start when it comes to history? And Tunde essentially proposed that we start with contemporary history, current history, and you sort of work your way back. You do some digging, you do some excavating. But then again, that's Tunde's proposal. In a sense, it's a curriculum proposal. For a better term, you're sort of saying, okay, what you would do if you were to put together a curriculum, is start from the modern day and work your way back. Again, there's many ways to skin that cat. I think the main thing is that we don't revise history, okay, or apply current sort of moral values and expectations to worlds and societies and peoples gone by. Even though, as Hamza said, fundamentally we're all the same. We've been the same, but political situations and circumstance change. In terms of etiquette and social etiquette, that develops and changes. So of course you can't map perfectly the moral landscape, let's say, to people in the 19th century. And the reason why I say that is because it is really about how we truly grapple with the bulk of history, the heft of it, because it is really quite difficult and it's quite big to sort of get your hands around. I mean, for me, I was never really a history buff, but one of the things that I'm beginning to understand is that because of my love for art, I'm beginning to understand history.
The importance of it. Yeah.
history through the kind of prism or through the sort of portals of artworks. So if I think to myself, oh, okay, the Guernica, then I think, okay, then that tells me a little bit about the Spanish Civil War. It also tells me about the state of affairs at that time, and it also tells me about Pablo Picasso's political.
100%, yeah.
If we go even further back, okay, yeah, all right. So we know that they were, Renaissance images, and a lot of these images would, propagate religious imagery and so on, which actually says something about Europe at the time. It says something about where Christianity was in terms of public opinion, and in the halls of power, corridors of power, but it also tells you about, the artists who benefited from, patrons who saw, those religious stories as being important and something that needed to be documented, something that needed to be immortalized in a sense. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's many ways to skin this cat. For me, as long as we are not trying to revise it, as long as we're not trying to simplify too much or make history cartoony to the point where there is, a villain with horns and a tail and a pitchfork, but on the other hand, we have people that have halos and they can do no wrong. I think that perspective of seeing things in that very, very simplistic binary is one of the issues I think that we're facing, even with, the taking down of statues and all that kind of stuff. It's the simplification and making history cartoony. And I think this links really well to like BLM. And I think BLM, I remember there's a story, I think it was a novel written by Toni Morrison called The Pearl. And what happens is, I think someone, a local from a particular neighborhood, finds a pearl at the bottom of the ocean. And obviously this pearl is worth a lot of money. And what happens is anyone who comes in contact with the pearl, they sort of look into the reflection of the pearl and kind of imagine what their life would be like if they had the pearl. They can imagine, who they would become, and what they could possess and have and achieve and so on. And I do think sometimes BLM has kind of become all things to all men. On one hand, I think from the sentiment of Black Lives Mattering, I mean, that's undeniable. I mean, and it also makes a really good hashtag, but it's clear, obvious, everybody, I would like to think in the 21st century, across every continent, everyone fundamentally believes that Black Lives Matter. But I think the issue is where we talk about BLM being all things to all men is that for some people, BLM is too many things at the same time. Because it's too many things at the same time, you can have a conversation where some people are praising it and some people are disparaging it. You can have a conversation where, they've definitely brought awareness to some of the issues that are going on within the workplace or within society at large. But on the flip side, we actually look at maybe the organization and the roots of the organization, especially some of the sort of philosophical roots of the organization. You then start to question if you want to align yourself with this organization. So we can't forget that BLM have a website. They are an organization. The sentiment for me existed before the organization. The sentiment was something that was pushed into the kind of zeitgeist, from the civil rights. Do you know what I mean? From early, probably even earlier than that. But we know that from the civil rights movement, that sentiment of Black Lives Mattering, sort of was out there in the open with non-violent protests, that sort of philosophy from Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, This whole idea of satyagraha, we protest something with non-violence, and we are protesting the fact that we are equal to our white counterparts. Black lives matter. That was the sentiment. It wasn't specifically said, but that was the sentiment. And of course, that we could argue was codified in law or policy with, I think it was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And that was actually kind of codified in those things. So my question is, and not even only that, there's other organizations that come out in favor of leveling the playing field of equity across the board in terms of opportunity. Okay. For me, I feel a bit weird when I'm trying to imagine equality of outcome, just because not everybody may want the same outcome. And so I think to say you want equality of outcome, I think is a bit of a dangerous.
The definition varies from person to person.
So what
I want a house, I want a car, I want money. It's whatever the case may be.
Well, my actual question is, BLM as an organization are now 8 years deep. They celebrated their 8th year. Do we need them anymore? In fact, did we need them before? Bearing in mind, we had the civil rights movement. Bearing in mind, we have the NAACP in America. Basically, it's the I think it's like the National Association for I think it's like for the improvement for the improvement of colored people. NAACP. I probably even butchered that anyway. And then we had like things like SNCC. We know that SNCC kind of like sort of like disbanded or whatever. But we have had, and we still do have, organizations, grassroots organizations that are doing the work. What I'm saying is, do we truly need them? Because for me, the sentiment Black Lives Matter has always been around. It may have not been verbalized in that way, and there was no hashtag as a prefix, but it's always been there.
I would say one thing, I'm trying not to make this a doom and gloom thing, but I would say what happened recently with the Euros, the finals, would prove that maybe it's still needed. And even some of the pushback from people just kneeling, that just shows I think to me anyway, it proves that I think there is still some work that needs to be done. That's just my opinion on it.
So okay. So for me, okay, what then do you want the organization to do?
This is the thing.
Are you saying that are you saying that it's possible to divorce the statement from the organization? Because you have to look. Obviously, we've seen the website. Yeah. And look, don't get me wrong, they've only been around for 8 years. If you look at NAACP, they've been around for a long time. Yeah. So obviously, when comparing the two websites, Black Lives Matter do appear very kind of it doesn't feel as though the philosophy is that well thought out.
I agree. And I think that's some of the criticisms that they get. But the thing is, because every person within the BML, I suppose maybe dedication is not the right word, but I guess I suppose I'm trying to think of the best word to use here without sounding offensive. Okay,
use your word. Use your word.
Everyone, let's just say, okay, everyone has a varying degree of enthusiasm. Let's just say that, right? There's some that could be more militant than others. And in that, you can't help, sometimes the impression given can be off because of that, because there's so many different people that, people typing different things about how they feel. So someone might read something a more militant person from the BML might say, and they go, oh, that's really violent. And someone else might say that's something that's quite meek and, quite unoffensive, kind of thing. So it's so broad. But
Hamza.
Yeah.
And look, I'm in a sense playing devil's advocate. I'm not necessarily. Actually, I'm gonna because I was gonna say I'm not necessarily against BLM, but
neither am I.
But again, but as an organization,
yeah.
But I think I might have to park that idea, just because I want to be true to my speech. I want what I'm saying. Think because here's the thing. If you look at the website, it clearly says defund the police. Now here's the thing. No, it's true.
No, but I can't say that every one of them believe that.
But
like
it's on.
I know, I get that.
Okay, all right, but the thing is, here's my thing. Right?
Yeah,
here's my thing. Take the word pride for gay pride, for example. That existed before it became a festival in the middle of London or San Francisco or whatever, right?
And remember though, there's also shades to pride, because remember, pride was also one of the deadly sins. So you've got to remember, but it's true. You got to remember that you can still be proud of your heritage or proud of who you are as a person and proud of your fundamental identity. But again, too much pride, Christopher,
And I think that's what's scaring a lot of people, especially within the, supporters of the Black Lives Matter. Oh, why can't I be proud of being white? But this is why it's a bit of a tricky thing. But sorry, what were we going to say? Sorry, man.
Yeah, it's all right. So I'll put my cards on the table.
Yeah.
As an organization, I don't think it's fit for purpose, right? I think as a symbol, as a hashtag, it's much more important.
Yeah.
Now, the issue you come across is, but the issue you come across is this, which is the machinery of government is now tuned to the ears of lobbyists, right? It's now tuned to the ears of lobbyists. So how do you get people there to lobby for your cause? You need money. You need backers. Definitely need a website. You need a website. You need some rallying mottos or whatever. And the hashtag, the sentiment slowly develops roots, which then people can like or dislike, and they become points of contention. But that's because it's kind of like when something happens, I don't know, some kids do something stupid in Hackney, and then a leader of the Black community comes on TV and says, "Oh, we don't stand," and you kind of think like, I don't even know this guy, yet somehow he's speaking on behalf of me, And I think ultimately Black Lives Matter has become that. And even if you look at how things are going with the chapters and all of these types of things, it's not even a consistent thing. It's essentially like a wild west of social justice, because even last year, the protest in Bristol, where the Edward Colston statue was toppled, that had nothing to do with BLM in the United States. They had no idea it was happening.
But you know what's interesting though? BLM have now in their website said that they are a global organization. So they're now acknowledging,
those
done in the name of BLM elsewhere.
But the way I see that is kind of like how ISIS and ISIS used to get down. Something bad, and then some guy from ISIS would be like, "Yeah, that was us." It was like something crashes.
Or the IRA.
And at the time, everyone was so on the edge about terrorist attacks or whatever. It's like, was it ISIS? And ISIS just go, "Yeah, it was us." And you had that impression that they were global.
That's from ISIS. Now to our correspondent from Europe.
Hey, come on, but you could believe it with all of those slick videos that they were putting out all the time.
The marketing, the ISIS marketing team is actually on point, man. I have to admit,
their PR was couldn't go apart from the whole beheading thing, but but I think it's a thing like that where it's like actually they realize this thing is snowballing to such an extent that we can't control it. So the only way to control it is to let it grow. It's like if you got Japanese knotweed growing under your house, you can't get rid of that stuff. It's borderline immortal. So you know what? I like Japanese knotweed. I put it there. I planted it. All of these weeds are mine. You know.
Actually, you can't do that, man. It's actually illegal to grow. No, but I hear what you're saying.
Okay, if anyone's Japanese knotweed, if that grows in your house, then you might as well pack up shop because you can't sell your house basically because of it. But that's what I think about the organization. I think it's something that, because the message and the sentiment is valid and it is something that everybody resonates with, it allows people to pick it up and interpret it. So for me, when someone says Black Lives Matter, what I think about is, you got the film Hidden Figures, the computers, the ladies who supported the NASA calculations for the space mission.
Oh,
You've got all those individuals who have contributed, whether it's technology or to the arts, throughout history, who basically only get recognized in Black History Month, right? And then, of course, you've got the disproportionate crime statistics, particularly in the United States, right? So when you're talking about Black Lives Matter, you're speaking directly to those social movements. But then when you create that organization and you have to build a pillar around which we can all congregate, you are going to run the risk of alienating certain people. And defunding the police as a political motive is a bad motive, in my opinion. But I don't think it makes them a Marxist organization or a Russian sleeper cell, like some people would like to kind of claim it. It's just, I wouldn't have agreed with that policy because that doesn't speak to me or anybody.
Anyway, it's funny because at first I was thinking to myself, sorry, Hamza, sorry.
Yeah.
I was thinking to myself, maybe it's hyperbole. Maybe they're doing hashtag defund the police to get attention. So you say something far-fetched, so that you actually get people's eyes and ears. If that was the case, it's kind of like a political fiction. You know what I mean? You do it so that it's not really true, but we'll do it so that
all politicians do that.
Hear me out.
Yeah, Karen.
It's not really true, but we want to raise this as an issue so it's on your radar so that you're aware of this being the topical issue at the moment. But again, when you go to the manuscript, i.e. the website, of BLM, no, they have actually made it explicit. This is not hyperbole.
Oh.
This is not just a
topic of
sensation. We're not trying to sensationalize here. This is what we want, and they believe that defunding the police is in direct correlation to murders and killings happening within the Black community. Now,
just the thing is,
into the weeds of the data regarding, how many people are killed by the police annually in America.
But Mike, before you say, can I just say one thing? Obviously, as I mentioned before, my knowledge on the subject is not great. It's not particularly vast. But my understanding is they just want resources redirected into community projects. Essentially, isn't that the basis?
Basically, but what I'm saying is, why is that a zero-sum game? Why can't you have police being funded and communities being funded?
It's a fair point. I mean, ultimately, the problem here that we have, I mean, say what you will about how America's spending the money, right? Maybe that's something that they have to talk to the actual government about, to be fair. As opposed to, as you said, as opposed to defunding the police, government, maybe you should sort this out in terms of actually developing our communities here. But
how do you get that government attention without protest, without picking up a fuss, without uproar?
Well, that's the thing. Is there realistically a way to do that without?
I think they're showing that this is a way, right? So as uncomfortable, as annoying as it is, it does get attention. So it puts it on the agenda.
Yeah. But that's the thing. In doing that, though, unfortunately, you start to have bad PR. People start to think of you in a particular way, which is unfortunate.
Make everyone happy.
No, exactly. But that's the only way you can get attention. Surely, right?
But here's the thing. Though. I think my issue, because remember, if you look at the website as well, you got to remember, and especially if you think about the various sort of BLM chapters, as Tunde rightly said earlier, you've got to remember that they don't only have one way of getting the word out. So they get the word out through protest. Now, obviously, there's going to be some bad actors. You know, some people that kind of jump on the protest bandwagon, and then when it's going on, start looting. You know, and doing all these things, burning police cars, all of these things. So they may not necessarily affiliate themselves with those bad actors, but these bad actors exist. You know what I mean? Obviously, the villains and thing, man. The jokers of the pack. So obviously,
we were all packing placards. I wanted to know why you're bringing a Molotov cocktail. Like, what's that for? Like, just in case I get a little thirsty.
Yeah, there's always someone.
Why are you bringing a stone? Hey, man, you might want to write something, scrawl something on the concrete, you know.
But why so big? No, 100%.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is, you know, obviously they don't only have one way of making money or making people aware. So they have, you know, something. They have a donation section. They have a section where they would have they may have an article where they're speaking about an issue. At the end of the article, they usually have something like, you know, I forget what you call it, but essentially something that you can sign, petition that you can sign to, you know, to stop something from happening, to, you know, to back a certain policy, to back a certain politician, etc., etc. Obviously, which is in line with, you know, the sort of the BLM agenda. But for me, what is the most seen and the most vocal is people going out in the streets and in some cases being quite violent. Now, I want us to kind of think about the civil rights movement for a minute. Yeah. The civil rights movement, especially when we look at even organizations like the NAACP, is fundamentally about equality of the races. It's not one race should get more than any other race, or we should get all our, you know, our resources together to support one group of people. It was equality from the get-go. You know, obviously the whole, the sort of whole spirit behind the whole, you know, the MLK I Have a Dream was we can actually walk hand in hand in the spirit of brotherhood, regardless of your race, regardless of your color, your creed, and even your sexuality. We had people like Bayard Rustin who would support MLK, and, you know, Bayard Rustin did not have the same religious outlook as MLK, but they all walked and marched under the same banner of equality for everybody. But I have a feeling, and I could be wrong, okay, but I have a feeling that when people think about BLM as it stands 8 years deep today, they think about a kind of special interest group. It's not a global human interest group. It's a special interest group specifically for Black community. Now, here's the thing. I've been fortunate to have grown up, obviously, with a mother who was very much involved in community. You know, obviously, we lived in Harlesden. She was one of the founders of one of the first play schemes in Harlesden. And interestingly enough, we actually got funding from the current, it was actually the Labour Party at the time, the Blair Labour Party at the time. And that's what helped fund the play scheme and help a lot of these young people go to places like, you know, Science Museum, National History Museum, Thorpe Park. We got equipment like sports equipment, things like that. So I don't have any. So in some ways, sometimes when people want to vilify Blair, you know, Blair did actually do some really good stuff. And the Labour government under Blair did some really good stuff for the Black community. Hence why there is that stigma or attached to, you know, the Labour Party that, you know, if you're Black, you vote Labour type of thing. Because they have got a good track record in terms of supporting the Black community within Britain. So I say that to say that I'm not opposed to the Black community being given certain resources, especially in those areas that are deprived. However, if we think about the spirit with which the civil rights movement operated, it was all about kind of like the equality of the races. It was all about, look, we just want to be considered as equals. We just want the law to apply to us equally. That's really what we want. We don't want favoritism. We don't want you to rub our backs and say, oh, they're there. We don't want you to have to bow down in the street, tie our laces, all these sort of symbolic gestures or platitudes that put us on some sort of pedestal. We just want to be considered equal. But I don't know if that's the same vibe that we're getting with BLM. And it's funny because I didn't really say much about BLM when it first came out because so much was going on. Remember, it's kind of similar situation that happened with Mark Duggan. Remember, Mark Duggan was unfortunately killed by the police. Then of course the riots happened. Okay, that was the kind of knock-on effect. The riots happened, and obviously, as we spoke about before, bad actors kind of hijacked part of the movement. Similarly, with BLM, George Floyd happened. When you see something like that, especially if you've seen the clip, even to this day, I haven't watched the video because I don't want to.
It's pretty hard to watch, to be honest.
I don't want to watch someone's life being snuffed out. Because it's not Hollywood. It's not like you're watching a Marvel and thing. This is some guy's life. So for me, yes, when you think about what happened with George Floyd, I mean, and even now, they're still thinking they're in the courts at the moment, isn't it, with Chauvin?
No, he's convicted of murder.
He was,
convicted of murder.
But here's the thing, yeah. Like, I don't know because I almost feel like, yes, BLM, that was the sort of, it was an appropriate kind of knee-jerk response, to what we've seen. But I don't know if it's something that can sustain a kind of that same vibe, that same spirit of equality, where I don't know, man. I just feel like with the civil rights movement, there was a certain moral high ground.
Yeah, are we just looking at history, going back to the whole history thing, with rose-tinted glasses here? Like, if we were, we forget there was also a lot of violence as well in some of these protests. Granted, yes, for the most part, it was peaceful, and that was the.
This is why I'm specifying, MLK. It's not. And here's the thing: I say MLK, but it's not. MLK has kind of become symbolic because it's not only MLK.
Yeah,
it's obviously Coretta. It's
there was a Black Panther movement as well.
Yeah. It's JFK to a certain degree.
Yeah.
So it's not just him, but the reason I want to because even with Malcolm X, obviously El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, even he would have kind of reformed because he kind of thought, you know what, actually, the approach I had before, I'm not going to take it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do the same thing. So what I'm saying is, this approach, the sort of very kind of militant approach, it may get eyes and ears, but is it doing damage to...
I'm sorry to quote you. Can I just say one thing? But have we given BML time to evolve to a more, I suppose, peaceful outlook or a way to, I don't know, conduct themselves differently? I'm sorry. That's all I want. I'm gonna
finish. Can I finish? Because you keep saying BML, man.
That's vibes.
BLM. Yeah. Have we? Because obviously we can say that because obviously it's hindsight. We have history to see how he eventually reformed, if you will. But have we maybe not given them enough time to do this? And as I think Tunde said before, I think personally, the sentiment I think is very important. I genuinely do. I kind of alluded before the fact that the whole thing that happened recently with the Euros and stuff like that, clearly there is still a lot of injustice. I mean, why are people getting so angry that someone is just kneeling? I mean, there's something still wrong here.
It's funny because I have, my opinion's kind of evolved on what happened at, the Euros final.
Oh, you agree with it, is
it? I think it's evolved because, all right, let's put it this way. Blacks from the Caribbean, from West Africa, obviously there were blacks before this date that I'm going to quote, but let's say like circa 1948, yeah, and onwards, yeah, blacks started to appear, and in Britain, and and for me, I always, and a lot of people might glaze over this, but I always think I don't see it as coincidental, that 1948 was the year that the NHS was kind of like instituted. And it's the very same year that, people, blacks and so on from other countries came to the country. I don't see that as an accident. Because if you look at the NHS today, there's so many ethnic minorities within the NHS that keep running. But it's not just them. It's also our white counterparts as well. And just as a sort of plug, hey man, the NHS they do a stand-up job, but underfunded. But the point is, I'm gonna move away from it. But the point is though, is that okay? So black people appear in 1948, circa 1948.
Like potties in it.
So we've been in this country for a while now. We've been in here for a while, and yes, there are going to be people that are racist, and we saw the proof of that, in the Euros final. But then I started to interpret it as, but if you are with someone, okay, if you're in a relationship, yeah, that you get to a point in your relationship, especially if it's a long-standing relationship, you get to a point where you make allowances for like certain behaviors, because you understand that it's a journey that both of you are on, and that over time, hopefully, the kind of union will help to kind of reform either party. And what I mean by that is sometimes I might do something which is understandably, well, it could be quite selfish. And then it gets pointed out to me, from my significant other, what you did was a little bit selfish, but we're kind of a unit now, we're a team. So perhaps you need to re-evaluate how you were acting in that scenario, in that situation. And I just wonder if those remarks was just a sign of a Britain that is truly multicultural. But because if you think about it, the racial remarks, I don't know. I might be treading into some.
Yeah, but I disagree with that. I think what we're looking at here is a symptom of a very oversimplified narrative about Britain. And also, I was going to say, with the nature of BLM, the almost militant nature that you mentioned, here's the thing, like even Gandhi will look back at it and people say, oh, it was a peaceful process. India was taken back peacefully. Well, not really. A lot of Indians died, and I'm pretty sure not all of them were pacifists. Once the event is closed, we kind of reduced it down that, well, 60% of the people were non-violent, so we'll cast it as non-violent, if you know what I mean. And then even with, around the time that
philosophy though. So look, you could. Okay,
but at the same time, someone could have been in Che Guevara's army, but not been violent. We have to at some point.
Yeah, it's the group that defines the movement. It's not the individuals.
Here's what I'm saying. I'm saying, should we not define something by the way in which it was intended? For example, remember we had a conversation in a previous Abstract Amoeba about morality. I remember one of the things that we were talking about was, you know, God kind of being a sort of gold standard for morality. And, you know, he's the sort of moral arbiter. And we were saying that, you know, ultimately what we should be aspiring to is that which is, you know, the sort of
good.
the embodiment of perfect morality. Now, where it comes to interpretation and quote unquote bad actors, that isn't. I don't think that should be a sort of criticism about.
Yeah,
but that's not criticism of the interpretation of the belief.
Yeah, but then I think that's holding the philosophy in one hand and just looking at the actual outcome on the other, right? So we're saying for the majority, India got its independence through peaceful protest. Yeah, on the whole, but that's a simplification because the British killed a lot of Indians before that, you know, and even though they may not have raised a fist, it was still violent.
Yeah, but that wasn't. So the Indians, in that sense, were not necessarily the aggressors.
So they might not have been, but I'm sure some of them had to defend themselves, man.
Not all of them.
That's what I'm saying.
Some of them did. But then also, like around the civil rights movement, there was loads of social upheaval. There was like the Brooklyn riots, human rights on Capitol Hill, and even in the UK, we had the
Brixton,
you know, like, and here's the thing with protest and change, which I find is quite funny because in the UK, we've recently implemented a new policing bill, which makes it more difficult to protest because you have to get permission and you can't be loud and you have to be in designated areas.
I can't lie, man.
Which
I think
make
that's a slippery slope.
Well, it is a slippery slope if the slope has slipped because that's
dangerous, man.
Then if it can be comfortably ignored, then it's not going to evoke discomfort. It's not going to create dissonance and challenge people. Unfortunately, I think
status quo remains.
Obviously, I'm going to sound like one of those Che Guevara guys. I don't think violence necessarily means physical violence towards another human. But I do think the nature of protest is disruption. If you don't disrupt, why would anybody pay attention? And so that's why with the taking the knee thing, I think it's you know, you got to give Colin Kaepernick his dues because what he did was sort a way to make protests on a large platform with the consent of, and it's the irony of all of this, which is that of him being called unpatriotic, is that he sought out the advice of veterans to find a better way to protest during the national anthem that wouldn't be offensive to the US flag and to the US military. And veterans told him, you know, you should take the knee. And that's what he did, right? And so that's kind of grown legs. And obviously it's been sort of co-opted into the BLM sort of thing. But then that's allowed for, I think in the UK, during the European Championships, that's allowed for very reductive and lazy, casual form of discrimination to creep in, playing into political motivations. Because when the England team essentially declared, we are taking the knee as a symbol of being against racism, clearly, like objectively, that's what they said they were doing it for. How can you then come out and say, no, you're not. You're doing that to support BLM, which is a Marxist organization, which I disagree with. And that's the one side. I don't think BLM are a Marxist organization. But I think that almost lazy excuse allowed some people to, I would say it is a form of casual racism, because at the end of the day, if someone is protesting against it, what's the problem to you? You know, like it's literally 5 seconds before the game kicks off. If it's that abhorrent to you, you know, then why aren't you, you know, if it's that abhorrent to you, what is causing that discomfort in you? And in a way, that's exactly what protest should do. So, of course, some people will boo. And as we've seen, and we can't really ignore it, the majority of people have showed support. Right? The majority of people have showed support. So even when the murals of Marcus Rashford in Manchester were vandalized with, you know, all these types of slurs, you know, the response was overwhelmingly positive. You know, and I think it is a symbol that we are becoming less tolerant towards discrimination. But discrimination is not going to suddenly vanish because some guys took a knee on a football pitch.
No. 100%.
But yeah, I think there's on the side of the people who are booing, I think there's a lack of understanding about what they're actually booing, what they are actually booing.
You made a very good point. Sorry to cut you short. You see the whole thing with the knee, right? How now people, they they associate with the Black Lives Matter movement. It reminds me of when I worked in Forbidden Planet, right? You know the what was that Guy Fawkes mask from what's that movie again?
Vendetta.
V for Vendetta. So there was a customer that came in and she was like, "Oh, how can they sell that here?" Then I overheard some of the conversation. I realized she was attributing to. Do you remember there was that internet group that were wearing it, and I think they were like exposing people and stuff, right? And then she somehow mixed it with ISIS for some weird reason because I was overhearing the conversation, and I was like, I kind of was thinking to myself, you're an idiot, because this is actually from V from Vendetta, which is a comic book thing, which has something to do with Guy Fawkes. Now she completely got the message completely confused here. And then judging from how she was speaking, she was actually offended, but she had no reason to be offended, if you know what I'm trying to say.
I don't know if that's true. If she had no reason to be offended.
No, but because I heard she was thinking of a kind of like an ISIS type thing here.
But the reason why I would still, I would say that it was unreasonable that she was offended. But I don't think that there was no reason for her not to.
No. I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
I'll tell you why though. Because even you as an artist know, same thing with words, it accrues meaning. You accrue definition over time. So like there are certain artifacts within art. There are certain like iconic things within art that have kind of acquired a sort of cultural relevance. It almost alludes to other things.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Swastika, for example.
The swastika, exactly. Yeah. Even though initially it was meant to be something straight out of Hinduism, something to do with peace and well-being, it was reappropriated. And now, obviously, because of that definition, that meaning that it's accrued, if you write or draw a swastika on your work, you're considered to be some sort of...
Even if it is the peaceful one, because no one can remember which side it's meant to be.
Be some sort of white nationalist or white supremacist if you draw that symbol. The point I'm trying to make is that with that Guy Fawkes head, it could have accrued other meanings based upon maybe people who have donned those masks and have done crimes in the past.
I get that. But the point I was trying to make here, just like with the kneeling thing, there's been almost a kind of miscommunication or not a lack of awareness of the origin is what I'm trying to say. So now you're associating things that don't even tally, if that makes any sense.
This is why I think if you're going to take the knee, but also don't be surprised if the symbol cannot contain all it needs to in order to give a clear message to those looking at the symbol. Because symbols can accrue things that go against ultimately what the symbol is trying to portray.
It becomes bigger.
But at the same time, symbols can accrue additional meaning. I think symbols can also lose potency. So, what is it? The 1968 Olympics, when the US athletes raised their fist, for Black Power, and as a result, their athletic careers were basically ended. The Australian athlete who was in support, he didn't raise his fist, but was in support. He bowed his head. His career was also ended. Now if you were to do that, no, I mean, in fact, I think you even see some players will take the knee and raise their fist at the same time. Like all the symbols.
Just in case you missed the first one.
Yeah. But so clearly raising the fist, Black Power has lost some meaning or impact. Over time, there'll be something else. Maybe rubbing your head and patting your belly would be the new form of protest. And that symbol would rile people up when they see it. And they'll no longer care about people taking the knee. But fundamentally, I think why Black Lives Matter as a concept is still necessary is because of the outrage.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing. I don't think that our argument, well, especially my argument, is not with the sentiment and with the concept of Black Lives Mattering. I have a Black family. I have a Black son. I've been in support of my community since I can't remember how young I was. That's not the issue for me. But I don't know. I just do think we do have to be careful. I speak for myself. I would have to be careful with who I align myself with. Especially when looking at the fine print of an organization. Now, someone may come out to me and say, well, Mike, you don't know enough about BLM, the organization, to make that statement. And that's why I would say I will put myself in a place of, I wouldn't say on the fence, but I will do my due diligence and then make my decision based upon the research and based upon things that I see BLM as the organization doing. Because ultimately, maybe we are looking at, the civil rights movement with rose-tinted glasses. That's true. I know that many people that initially supported the civil rights movement, circa 1968, stopped supporting the civil rights movement, even at that time, because of the way they thought it was going and how they were sort of pushing for more sort of like political clout as opposed to, more community-oriented change. Community-oriented change. They felt that change would sort of trickle down from the corridors of power in that way, as opposed to the grassroots, from the ground up. And so there were even people that were dissenting, after MLK was assassinated from the civil rights movement. So what I would say is BLM as a sentiment, Black Lives Matter. It's obvious. It's a no-brainer. But I just hope that we can retain the same kind of, I suppose, sentiment that the NAACP have, the same sentiment that, the civil rights movement had in the idea of the equality of the races. I don't want to alienate my white counterpart. I don't want to alienate, my brother or sister who might be white or, what I mean? And almost put them in a position where they have to handle me with kid gloves. They've got to kind of walk on eggshells.
100%.
They don't want to. They can't even really say a joke, something in jest. Referring to some sort of, a sort of cultural, something culturally to be funny. They can't even do that. They can't be relaxed. I don't really want that because that's not a true friend. I want, if we're talking about true brotherhood and friendship and all that kind of stuff, there needs to be some sort of layer. What do you call it? Levity to conversations.
Yeah, and I agree. I do agree with that, and I also think there's another piece here, maybe which we didn't go into, but like BLM. Black Lives Matter, right? But what about Aboriginal lives? What about Native American lives? Like and I would like to think that the term BLM actually doesn't really mean just Black, but those individuals or those communities that are disproportionately affected by particular social structures. There's a highly disproportionate rate of Aborigine imprisonment and alcoholism in Australia. And unemployment. And I would like to think Black Lives Matter also encompasses those guys, also encompasses, Taiwanese who might be feeling oppressed by certain regimes. I don't know if we say who might get cancer. But, there's a thing there where... yeah. But, but it's basically, that's what I mean about the sentiment. You know, like ultimately there are disenfranchised people who are at the rough end of the political system or the social structure, who essentially need, yeah, we do have the civil rights movement. We have had the civil rights movement. People are aware, but it doesn't hurt to have more awareness. But I do agree about the political nature of BLM, particularly the specifics of the organization. It's up to you. But it's like anything, you know. But do you know how many people vote Labour, Conservative, Democrat, Republican, and never read a manifesto?
Yeah.
You know,
they just do it because maybe
kind
their
of
parents did it.
Yeah, you know, I think some people kind of get, and I think that is a danger. Whether you support BLM or don't, you know, whether you boo the England players taking the knee because you think BLM is Marxist, but you've never actually gone to their website and read anything, or you know, you support BLM, but actually you've never read anything on their site about defunding the police, and that's not, you know, I think that lazy approach to social justice or what you perceive as being a political direction, I think is more damaging than anything BLM might do or anybody. You know, I think that's a real concern.
I agree. In closing, though, is there any final statements anyone wants to say on the matter, or are we good?
Hey man, I would just say that for me, Black Lives Matter, the statement, sentiment, I'm 410%. Of course it matters. Of course Black Lives Matter. Of course. And I think, you know, this might sound very Rastafarian, but I think people need to sort of overstand like a lot of like the political machinations and slogans and political game playing from both sides, from either side of the political spectrum. Because I think it's those things, it's whether it's the sort of linguistic machinery or political machinery or, you know, cultural symbols that sometimes get in the way of us actually doing the real work and just being united. Sometimes they get in the way. Sometimes they help. Sometimes they get in the way. What my hope and desire is that whether it's something to help, or it's something to push forward equality, I just hope and pray that it doesn't detract from it, doesn't take away from it, and just helps to get us there. Because ultimately, we are all equal. We are, you know, I think it was Maya Angelou that said that, you know, you cannot be more human than I am. We're both human. I might have more responsibility than you, which means I may have more money than you, but I can never be more human than you.
Yeah, I agree. And something Tunde kind of said as well, whatever kind of group you want to affiliate yourself with, you have to be educated on what you do, because ultimately you're going to be defined by whatever they believe in. That's just the truth. You may be an individual, but it's the group really that are, you know, held accountable for whatever actions they may, you know, decide to kind of engage in. So you have to be very careful about this. But thank you again for joining us. We'll try and get the next one out. We're obviously going to discuss what the next topic is. Or if you have a suggestion, let us know if there's something you want us to tackle. But until then, take it easy and thank you.